The cold was a living thing in the fortress kitchens. It seeped through the stone floor, a constant, biting chill that her thin boots could not repel. It crept under her threadbare tunic, raising goose flesh on her arms. But the worst cold was in her hands, plunged into a basin of icy water as she scrubbed potatoes until her knuckles were raw and red. They called her Alara. Or rather, they didn't call her anything at all. She was a shadow, a ghost who haunted the periphery of the northern Fang Pack. Omega, outcast, taster. Her existence was a simple, brutal equation. She scrubbed, she cleaned, she obeyed. And 3 times a day, she sat before the lavish meals prepared for the Alpha King and tasted every single dish. A single, small, deliberate bite from each platter. Then, she would wait. She would wait for the telltale burn in her throat, the clenching in her gut, the fire in her veins that would signal the presence of nightshade or wolfsbane or the more exotic poisons from the southern lands. She was a living poison detector, a disposable tool to ensure the king's safety. Her life was worth less than a plate of roasted venison. She knew this. Everyone knew this. A sharp voice sliced through the quiet scrape of her brush against potato skin. "Still breathing, scum taster?" Alara flinched, her shoulders hunching instinctively. She didn't have to look up to know it was Lyra. Lyra, whose father was a senior warrior, whose scent was of smug satisfaction and cheap floral perfume. "I am," Alara whispered to the murky water. Lyra laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Pity! It would save us the trouble of feeding you." She sauntered closer, her fine leather boots making arrogant clicks on the flagstones. She nudged the bucket of clean potatoes with her toe, sending it skittering across the floor. They tumbled out, rolling into the grime and straw. "Oops, looks like you have more work to do." A familiar hot shame washed over Alara, but it was quickly extinguished by the pervasive cold of her reality. This was her place. This was her due. She was the daughter of traders, or so they had told her after her parents had vanished years ago, leaving her to the pack's cruel mercy. She bent down, her back aching, and began to gather the dirtied potatoes. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury she could not afford. They only invited more scorn. Instead, she gritted her teeth, a tiny, silent act of rebellion. She would endure. She would survive this day, just as she had survived all the others. That night, the world tried to tear itself apart. A blizzard descended from the frozen peaks, a howling monster of wind and ice. It slammed against the fortress walls with the force of a battering ram. The wind shrieked through the arrow slits, a chorus of hungry ghosts. Alara huddled in her small cot in a storage alcove off the main kitchen, shivering under a thin blanket, listening to the fortress groan under the assault. Then came a sound that was not the wind. It was a deep, grinding roar, a scream of stone giving way. The floor beneath her trembled violently. Dust and ice crystals rained down from the ceiling. Shouts erupted from the halls, guards running, the clang of alarm bells, nearly lost in the storm's fury. Curiosity, a dangerous and long-dormant instinct, warred with her ingrained fear. She crept from her alcove. The main kitchen was a scene of chaos. A section of the thick outer wall, the one directly behind the hearths, had collapsed inward. A mountain of snow, ice, and massive stone blocks now filled a third of the room. The wind howled through the breach, a physical blow that stole her breath. She saw a flicker of movement near the rubble. One of the young kitchen hands, a boy named Finn, was trapped, his leg pinned beneath a fallen beam. Alara didn't think. For the first time in years, she acted. She scrambled over the treacherous debris, her bare hands scraping against sharp stone. "Finn!" she called out, her voice thin against the gale. He was conscious, his face pale with shock and pain. She grabbed the edge of the beam, her muscles straining. It was impossibly heavy. Useless. She was useless. The thought was a familiar poison in her own mind. Suddenly, the storm's roar seemed to diminish, overshadowed by a presence so immense, so powerful, it felt like the mountain itself had walked into the room. Warriors in black wolf pelt cloaks poured into the kitchen, their forms massive and imposing. But they all parted, creating a path for the one who followed. Alpha King Kalen. He was a legend made real, a creature of winter and wrath, taller and broader than any man she had ever seen, with hair the color of midnight and a face carved from granite and fury. He moved with a predator's grace, his presence sucking all the warmth from the air. His gaze swept the room, assessing the damage with an unnerving calm. Then his eyes, the color of silver in the torchlight, landed on her. On the pathetic sight of her trying to move the beam. Fear, cold and absolute, seized Alara. She froze, expecting a blow, a curse for being in his way. He didn't speak. He simply strode forward, the snow crunching under his boots. With an almost casual display of strength, he gripped the beam that had defied her every effort and lifted it as if it were a mere twig. He tossed it aside, and it crashed against the floor with a deafening boom. Two of his warriors immediately pulled Finn free, carrying the boy away toward the infirmary. Alara was left kneeling in the rubble, staring up at the king. He stood over her, a titan blocking out the storm. He extended a hand to her, a large, calloused hand that could snap her in two. It was not a request. It was a command. Her mind screamed at her to cower, to refuse, to make herself invisible. But her body, driven by some instinct older than fear, obeyed. Her trembling, filthy hand rose to meet his. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a silent cataclysm. A bolt of pure, white-hot energy shot up her arm, straight into her heart. It was agony and ecstasy, a fire that burned away the cold that had lived in her bones for a decade. The air crackled. Light, brilliant and blinding, erupted from the point of their contact. A scream was torn from her throat as a searing pain lanced across the back of her hand. It felt as if a brand was being pressed into her flesh, marking her, claiming her. Through the blinding light, she saw his eyes. They were no longer silver. They were molten gold, blazing with a terrifying, impossible intensity. They stared at her, not as a king looks at a servant, but as a wolf looks at its long-lost soul. The light faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving spots dancing in her vision. She snatched her hand back, cradling it to her chest. The pain was fading to a deep, resonant thrum. On the back of her hand, etched into her skin as if with fire, was a new mark. It was an intricate, glowing symbol of a coiled wolf, its form intertwined with a radiant, blazing sun. It pulsed with a soft, golden light. What was happening? What was this? The king stood frozen, his own hand held half raised. He stared at her, at the mark, his harsh face a mask of stunned disbelief. The air around him vibrated with a power she could feel in her teeth. He took a step closer. Alara scrambled back, crab-walking over the rubble, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not the thunder of a king, but a low, guttural rumble that shook her to her core. It was filled with 1,000 years of loneliness and a sudden, savage discovery. You, he breathed. The word was not an accusation. It was a revelation, a claiming. He took another step. Mine. Her mind fractured. Her instincts, long buried under layers of abuse and self-loathing, screamed a single, terrifying truth. Mate. But her conscious mind, the mind of the Omega, the taster, the worthless girl, could only feel terror. This was a mistake, a cruel joke. He would kill her for this blasphemy, for whatever dark magic had just occurred. She had to run. She lurched to her feet and fled. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from those burning golden eyes, from the impossible truth that had just branded itself onto her skin. She didn't get far. His warriors, moving with silent, wolf-like speed, were suddenly in her path. They didn't touch her, but their presence was a wall she could not pass. Kaelin walked slowly toward her, his golden eyes never leaving her face. The raw power coming off him was suffocating. "Do not be afraid," he said, his voice softer now, but no less absolute. How could she not be afraid? Her entire world had been upended in a single searing touch. The mark on her hand still throbbed, a constant warm reminder. It was a connection, a tether to this terrifying man. She could feel him, not just with her senses, but with something deeper. She could feel the shock, the fierce possessiveness, the bone-deep wonder that rolled off him in waves. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her torn tunic, the dirt on her face, the raw skin of her hands. A flicker of something dark and dangerous crossed his features as he took in her state. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice lethally quiet. Alara couldn't speak. She just shook her head, her body trembling uncontrollably. From the edge of the crowd of onlookers, a figure stepped forward. It was Lord Vorlag, a visiting alpha from the Southern Shadowclaw pack. He was lean and cunning, with eyes like chips of obsidian. He had been at the fortress for a week of tense negotiations. His gaze flickered from Kaelin's face to the still glowing mark on Alara's hand. A slow, reptilian smile spread across his lips. "It seems the great Alpha King has finally found his lost treasure," Vorlag said, his voice smooth as poisoned silk. "And in the kitchen, of all places. How quaint." Kaelin's golden eyes narrowed, turning from Alara to Vorlag. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You will hold your tongue, Vorlag, or I will tear it from your throat." Vorlag merely inclined his head, but his eyes never left Alara. He had seen. He knew. And the look in his eyes was not one of congratulations. It was one of cold, calculating opportunity. He looked at her as if she were a key, a weapon he had just discovered. Kaelin turned his attention back to Alara. He shrugged off his own heavy fur-lined cloak and, moving with a gentleness that seemed utterly at odds with his immense frame, he draped it over her shaking shoulders. It was incredibly heavy and warm, smelling of pine, winter storms, and him. The scent was overwhelming, yet strangely comforting. It settled a part of her that had been shivering for years. "Take her to my chambers," Kaelin commanded 2 of his guards. "See that she is cleaned and fed. No one is to harm her. No one is to even look at her unkindly. She is under my protection." He paused, his gaze locking with hers again. "She is mine." The declaration echoed in the ruined kitchen. It was a death sentence and a salvation all at once. Alara, the ghost, the nothing, was now the Alpha King's. She allowed the guards to lead her away, her legs unsteady. The king's cloak enveloped her, a cage of warmth and terrifying possession. As she was escorted out, she glanced back. Kaelin was still watching her, his golden eyes a promise. But beyond him, she saw Lord Vorlag, his dark eyes glittering with a chilling, predatory light. She had not been saved. She had just become the prize in a much more dangerous game. The king's chambers were larger than the entire kitchen. A fire roared in a hearth big enough to roast an ox. Furs and tapestries covered the walls and floor. It was a world of warmth and wealth she couldn't comprehend. Female servants, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity, led her to an adjoining bathing room. They moved around her with a hesitant reverence that was more unnerving than Lyra's open scorn. They helped her out of her rags and into a steaming tub of water scented with herbs. The hot water was a shock, a pleasure so intense it was almost painful. As she scrubbed away a decade of grime, she stared at the mark on her hand. The glow had faded, but the lines were stark and clear against her skin. A soul bond. The old stories whispered of them, fated connections that granted Alpha Kings immense power and stability. A bond he had apparently been waiting centuries for. And it had chosen her. A worthless, nameless taster. Why? After the bath, they gave her a simple but soft woolen dress. They offered her food, a tray laden with the very dishes she would normally have tasted for poison. The irony was a bitter pill. She couldn't eat. Her stomach was a knot of terror. She was left alone in the main chamber, huddled in a large chair near the fire, the king's cloak wrapped tightly around her. She felt like a stray dog brought in from the cold, waiting for its master to return and decide its fate. The wait was not long, but the person who came through the door was not the king. It was two of Lord Vorlag's men. They moved with the swift, silent deadliness of assassins. Before she could even scream, a heavy cloth was shoved over her mouth, reeking of a sweet, cloying herb that made her vision swim. An arm like an iron band wrapped around her waist, lifting her from the chair. Panic, raw and primal, erupted in her chest. She struggled, kicking and clawing, but it was useless. They were too strong. As they dragged her from the room, she saw the two royal guards who were supposed to be protecting her slumped against the wall in the corridor, their throats cut. A chain, cold and heavy, was wrapped around her wrists. The moment the metal touched the soul mark, an agonizing, burning pain shot through her. It was silver. The metal sizzled against her skin, and the warm thrum of the bond was instantly dampened, replaced by a sharp, severing agony. The connection to Kaelin, that new and terrifying sense, was choked off. The feeling was devastating, a sudden, violent amputation of a part of her she hadn't known she possessed until an hour ago. A wave of nausea and despair washed over her, and the world went dark. She awoke to the biting cold and the smell of damp stone and decay. She was in a cell, a true dungeon cell, with dripping walls and a single high barred window that showed only a sliver of stormy gray sky. The silver chains were still on her wrists, bolted to the wall. Every movement sent a fresh wave of fire through the bond mark. The absence of Kaelin was a physical hollowness in her chest, a void that ached with a terrifying emptiness. Was he looking for her? Did he even care? Or was he angry that his newfound treasure had been so easily stolen? The old voices of worthlessness whispered in her mind. Of course he doesn't care. You are nothing. A mistake. The heavy iron door of the cell creaked open. Lord Vorlag stood there, silhouetted by the torchlight from the corridor. He entered, his predatory smile firmly in place. Awake, little sunfleck? He purred, circling her like a vulture. I do apologize for the accommodations. They are, shall we say, temporary. What do you want? Alara's voice was a raw croak. What I have always wanted, he said, stopping in front of her. Power. The Northern Fang throne. For centuries, Kalen has been untouchable, his alpha power absolute. The legend said only the completion of his soul bond could make him stronger. They were wrong. He crouched down, his obsidian eyes gleaming. The bond is a conduit, a vulnerability. His strength, his very life force, is now tied to you. And a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. He reached out and traced the edge of her jaw with a cold finger. She flinched away. My Ember Covenant has studied the old magic, he continued, undeterred. We have found rituals that can do more than just dampen a bond. We can sever it. And when we do, the backlash will shatter his spirit, leaving him a broken, powerless shell. His pack will crumble, and I will be there to pick up the pieces. Horror, colder than any winter storm, washed over her. He wasn't just going to use her as a hostage. He was going to use her to destroy Kalen. You're a monster, she whispered. Vorlag laughed. I am a king, my dear, or I will be soon enough. And you are the key. He stood up and walked to the door. Rest. The ritual requires you to be conscious. I want you to feel every moment as your connection to him is torn apart. The door slammed shut, plunging her back into darkness and despair. Days blurred into a nightmare of cold, fear, and the gnawing pain of the sundered bond. They gave her just enough food and water to keep her alive. The silver chains ate at her flesh, the burn constant and agonizing. The hollowness in her chest grew, a cancer of loneliness and dread. She felt herself fading, the tiny spark of resilience she had nurtured for so long finally being extinguished. She was going to die here. And worse, her death would be the weapon that destroyed the one person who had, for a fleeting moment, looked at her and seen someone. In the depths of her despair, clinging to the last vestiges of her sanity, she did the only thing she could. She focused on the pain in her wrist, on the ghost of the connection that the silver tried to suppress. She reached for it, not with her hands, but with her mind, her spirit. She poured all her fear, her desperation, her pathetic, flickering hope into that broken tether. Kalen. His name was a silent scream in her soul. For a moment, there was nothing but the echoing void. She was about to give up, to let the darkness take her, when a flicker of warmth answered. It was faint, distant, but it was there. It was a feeling of incandescent rage, of a storm breaking its leash, of a mountain being torn apart from the inside. And then, a voice. Not in her ears, but in the very center of her being. A deep, rumbling promise that cut through the despair. Hold on. It was his voice. The bond, however damaged, was still there. I am coming. Hope, fierce and desperate, ignited within her. It was a tiny flame in an ocean of darkness, but it was enough. She held on to that promise, that sliver of warmth, as Vorlag's men came for her, dragging her from the cell and up a winding stone staircase. They took her to the fortress's highest tower, a circular room open to the raging blizzard. In the center of the room, a complex circle of runes was carved into the floor, glowing with a sickly red light. Vorlag stood by a stone altar, a ceremonial dagger in his hand. His followers, members of the Ember Covenant, chanted in a low, guttural language. The time has come, little sunfleck, Vorlag said, his voice triumphant. The time to unmake a king. They forced her to her knees in the center of the circle. The red light of the runes pulsed, feeding on her fear. Vorlag raised the dagger, its obsidian blade gleaming. With this cut, the bond will unravel, he shouted over the storm, and the Alpha King will fall. He lunged. The world did not explode in light this time. It exploded in sound and fury. The entire western wall of the tower disintegrated, blasting inward in a shower of stone and snow. A figure stood in the breach, silhouetted against the storm, a figure of pure, untamed wrath. It was Kalen. His eyes were not silver or gold. They were blazing pools of white-hot fire. His teeth were bared in a snarl that was more beast than man. Behind him, his elite guard, the Wolf Guard, poured into the room, their movements a blur of black fur and gleaming steel. The battle was instant and brutal. It was not a fight. It was a reckoning. Kalen moved like the storm given form, his fists and claws tearing through Vorlag's men. Vorlag, to his credit, did not panic. He shoved one of his own men at Kalen and turned back to Alara, his face twisted with frantic determination. "If I cannot have his throne, I will have his soul." He raised the dagger again, aiming for her heart. Kalen saw it. He roared, a sound of pure agony and rage, and tried to fight his way through to her. But he was too far. Two of Vorlag's mages threw up a shimmering wall of dark energy, blocking his path. He slammed against it, the barrier cracking but holding. He was trapped. He was going to have to watch her die. Seeing the despair and fury on his face, seeing the man who was her other half fighting and failing to reach her, something inside Alara broke. It was not the fragile, hopeless breaking of before. It was the shattering of a dam. The worthlessness, the fear, the years of pain and cold, all of it was incinerated in a sudden volcanic eruption of power. She had been a vessel for poison. She had been a vessel for despair. But deep inside her, hidden and dormant, had been a vessel for something else entirely. The sun. A wave of pure, golden light erupted from her body. It was not a gentle glow. It was a physical detonation of power. The light slammed into Vorlag, throwing him back against the far wall. It vaporized the silver chains on her wrists, freeing her. The sickly red runes of the ritual circle were scoured from the floor, replaced by the warm, brilliant light of a star. The wave of energy washed over the room. It did not harm Kalen's warriors, but it struck the Ember Covenant like a hammer blow, sending them reeling, their dark magic dissolving like smoke. The shield blocking Kalen shattered into a million pieces. Alara rose to her feet. She was no longer shivering. She was burning. Golden light poured from her skin, from her eyes, from the radiant sun mark on her hand. The pain of the severed bond was gone, replaced by a torrent of power that flowed between her and Kalen, healing, strengthening, completing. Vorlag staggered to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. What are you?" Kalen was staring at her, his rage momentarily forgotten, replaced by a look of profound, breathtaking awe. Alara looked at Vorlag, and for the first time in her life she felt no fear, only a cold, righteous anger. The timid, worthless girl was gone, burned away in the heart of her own private star. "You called me his weakest link," she said, her voice ringing with a power she had never known she possessed. "You were wrong." She raised her hand, the sun mark blazing. "I am his heart." She clenched her fist and the light followed her will. It was no longer a wave but a focused, searing beam of solar fire. It shot across the room and struck Vorlag. its place was a certainty that felt as deep and old as the mountains. "And you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "are mine." She reached up, her fingers tracing the harsh line of his jaw. As her skin touched his, the mark on her hand flared with brilliant light. At the same time, Kaelin let out a sharp hiss of breath. On his own hand, mirroring hers, a new mark was burning itself into existence. A silver crescent moon, its form intertwined with the familiar coiled wolf. Their bond was complete. Not a chain, but a circuit. Not a weakness, but a shared, infinite strength. She felt his love, his relief, his centuries of loneliness washing away like silt in a river. And he, she knew, could feel her own burgeoning strength, her acceptance, her dawning, overwhelming love for him. They returned to the northern Fang fortress not as a king and his stolen servant, but as a matched pair. The storm had broken, and the morning sun glinted off the fresh snow. Kaelin gathered the entire pack in the great hall. He stood on the dais, Alara beside him. He did not let go of her hand. "Lord Vorlag and the Ember Covenant are no more," he announced, his voice booming through the hall. "They sought to break us. They failed. They were defeated not only by the strength of our warriors, but by the power of your queen." He raised their joined hands, showing the twin marks to the assembled pack. A collective gasp went through the crowd. "For centuries, I have led this pack alone," Kaelin continued, his golden eyes finding Alara's. "No longer. This is Alara, my mate, my heart, and your Luna Queen. She wields the power of the sun itself. You will show her the same loyalty and respect you show me. Her word is my word. Her life is my life." In the crowd, Alara saw Lyra, her face pale with shock and utter terror. She saw the other servants, the warriors, all of them staring at her with a new, undisguised awe. She was no longer the scum taster. She was no longer invisible. Kaelin then did something that shocked them all. He knelt. Before the entire pack, the mighty Alpha King knelt before her, bowing his head. His wolf guard immediately followed suit, and then, like a wave, the entire pack, hundreds of them, knelt as one. They were kneeling for her. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in her life, they were not tears of pain or shame. They were tears of homecoming. Kaelin rose and gently pulled her forward so she stood before him, looking out at the sea of bowed heads. "They see you now," he murmured, his voice for her alone. She looked at her hand, at the sun and wolf mark that had changed everything. Then she looked at his, at the moon and wolf that mirrored it. She was not just a taster, a servant, an omega. She was a queen. She was a wielder of light. She was his. He was hers. She was home. The cold was finally gone, banished forever by the fire of a love as bright and powerful as the sun. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise passing between them. Their reign, together, was just beginning. And for the first time in her life, Alara felt not worthless, but infinite.